Let's talk about fertilizer. Hi, hello, I'm Adina, how are you? Hello everyone, I'm Adina from plantsbutbetter, and today we're talking about Philodendron Birkin. This is a very accessible plant if you're looking for a hybrid and if you're looking for variegation. And the cool thing about the variegation is the fact that it comes in stripes, which is unusual for most plants. I give it an 8 out of 10 in our care meter because if you're not careful, you may lose the variegation. I thought I should mention it because it's important to know if your plant will revert or not, especially since variegated plants are super popular at the moment. And this leads me to the next section of this video, in which we're going to talk about light. In a lot of cases, light is the #1 problem with these types of plants. If this philodendron doesn't get enough light, it will revert. So you should give it a lot of bright indirect light. And if you don't have that in your home, some grow lights are gonna do the job. Another problem you can get with this plant is that it can also turn incredibly white. I will show you a picture because I don't have an example with me. That could happen as well. You don't want too much white in your leaves either, because those leaves lack chlorophyll, and that's important for your plant to produce food. And usually white leaves, they will slowly turn brown and they will just die off. You still want to keep this plant in a bright place, but please be mindful that you could have these two problems if the light is too bright or if the light is lacking. Moving on to watering. When is best to water your philodendron? And I find that in this case, you should water it when the substrate is almost dry. So let's just say I water mine every 7 to 10 days during summer and every 2 weeks during winter. Maybe even more, because, you know, Eastern European winters are quite unforgivable. You can adjust your schedule depending on your home conditions. So if your home is a bit warmer, you can definitely water it a bit more. But please be mindful that this plant doesn't like excess water, so you don't want to exaggerate. The best thing that you can do is to check the soil every time you water it. Moving on to temperature, how hot she likes it. Something between 20 to 26 degrees Celsius is great, but please don't let it drop below 15 degrees Celsius because most plants don't like cold drafts. They lead to fungal infections and root rot and all that nasty stuff you don't want to be dealing with. That's it with temperature. Let's move on to humidity. You want to give this philodendron average to high humidity. I have 50 to 60% in my home and I tested it. It's quite good enough for this plant. But if you have a higher humidity in your home, is great. And if it's the other case in which your humidity is not that great, you could consider getting a humidifier because it will make a difference. Those tiny aerial roots that I will show in a B-roll right now are actually encouraged by humidity. And if you want to propagate this plant, in which I will talk about it in a minute, you should provide a higher amount of humidity for this plant. Let's talk about fertilizer. How often should I feed my plant? This philodendron should be fed maybe once every month during growing season, and usually in the winter time I stop. But if your plant is still growing, you can still feed it, as it's the case with almost any plant. If it's not dormant, you feed it. But it's great in the colder periods of time to dilute your solution a bit more and to use a bit less than it's actually specified on the package or whatever solution you have in your disposal. I use an NPK of 10-10-10 or 20-20-20, which is a very balanced NPK because I like to give my plants all the nutrients in the same ratio, but it's not necessary. I mean, you can use almost any fertilizer. And another thing that I want to say in this section is that actually you need to fertilize your plant with less fertilizer every goddamn time, because it's a variegated plant. And if you over-fertilize a variegated plant, it will lose variegation because feeding stimulates the chlorophyll in your leaves, and you have greater chances of those new leaves turning out green. So unless you really know what you're doing, please use less fertilizer for any variegated plant, not just this one. Moving on to substrate. So for this Philodendron Birkin, I actually use a mix that contains cocoa coir, some perlite, and some orchid barks, or some regular pine barks. So what I'm trying to say is that you should choose a mix that is very lightweight for your plant. This will help the excess water drain faster, and that's great for those roots, to keep those healthy roots. Don't use just regular potting soil because usually that is very heavy on the roots and that tends to get soggy really quickly, and then you may get problems with root rot. So be mindful about that. Moving on to plastic versus terracotta. So this philodendron doesn't get any problems with whatever pot you may choose. It can grow well in both, but if you choose terracotta, please check the soil a bit more often because that helps the water evaporate a bit quicker and you may adjust your watering schedule a bit. But other than that, this plant is great for both. Yeah, moving on to repotting. I would advise you to repot this plant only when it's super necessary. Like when you see the roots coming out of the pot, then it's time to move out. It's best to choose a pot slightly bigger than the previous one, like not double the size, because the roots will have problems accommodate in a way bigger substrate medium. Doesn't make any sense. Because the roots will have problems accommodate in a way bigger substrate environment, if that makes sense. And also it is favorable if you wait until the warmer periods of time, because usually in the summertime your plant is in the growing season and those roots will recover much faster from damage. That's not 100% necessary, but it could be something that you may consider. So, moving on to propagation. As I've said previously in this video, if you give this plant higher humidity, it will get you aerial roots. Those roots are super important if you want to propagate this plant. That doesn't mean you cannot propagate this plant without aerial roots, but those will make a difference. Those will help your plant get roots faster, and the easiest way you can do it is by stem cuttings. So you need a segment that will have at least one node. Just cut below the node or above the node. I mean, you need one node in your propagation, and then place it into water and wait until those roots are strong enough for soil. You can place them into a lightweight substrate as well, like directly into a substrate. For example, I find that sphagnum moss is really great for this type of propagation, and you can propagate it by air layering as well. If you choose water, don't forget to change the water at least once a week. You want that water to be fresh, to have oxygen, to help those roots grow quickly. Moving on to pests. And this one is a bit annoying when it comes to pests because I had trips, I think, twice on Philodendron Birkin. Not on this one specifically, but on other plants. In order to prevent a massive infestation, you need to check these plants every time you water them. Trips are, in my opinion, the worst pests ever, and if they multiply and take over, it will be very, very hard to get rid of them. But if you see just one or two, you do the treatment and then you repeat it for a couple of times and then you are safe for now. Check your plant every time you water it. That's very, very important. Prevention is the best medicine. Moving on to pets. Yeah, you heard that right. Is this plant safe for my pets? Unfortunately, this plant is not pet friendly, so I would advise you to keep it away from any curious cats or dogs. So as a conclusion, don't forget that this plant can revert. This is very important for you to know. I mean, I would have loved to know this before I bought it. This is a hybrid. This used to be in very high demand and used to be a very pricey plant, but now it's very accessible, and I find that to be a good thing because it has some unusual variegation that you could have at a very fairly price. If you have any questions or if I missed something about this care video, you could leave them in the comments. And until next time, don't forget to take care of yourself and your plants.